My betrayal was plotted over Sunday dinner. For 30 years, I believed Sunday dinner was sacred, the one table where every truth could be safely spoken. I now know it was the very place my brother and son met weekly to draft the blueprints for my financial execution. The carving knife wasn't the only blade at the table. The weight of the house felt good. Frank knew its every secret, from the way the floorboards in the hall sighed under a person's step to the exact groan the oak dining table made when he extended the leaf for Sunday dinner. He had framed this house with his own hands 35 years ago, driving every nail, setting every joist. Like the construction business he'd built from a single truck and a bag of tools, it was solid, honest, and meant to last for generations. The aroma of rosemary and garlic from a slow-cooked roast beef filled the warm air, a weekly sacrament that marked the rhythm of their lives. His wife, Maria, glided around the kitchen, her movements a familiar, comforting dance. Soon, the quiet hum of their home would be replaced by the lively chaos of family. His brother, Leo, would arrive first, always 10 minutes early, smelling of expensive cologne and restless ambition. Then his son, Mark, would follow with his wife, Sarah, and their daughter, 6-year-old Chloe, the small, bright sun around which their world now orbited. This was the ritual. This was the foundation. But from the moment they walked in, the foundation felt unsteady. Leo's handshake was firm, but his eyes darted around the room, never quite settling on Frank's. Mark gave his father a perfunctory hug, his shoulders tight, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over Frank's head. A strange, brittle energy crackled between brother and son, a silent current that Maria, ever the peacemaker, tried to ground with cheerful questions and plates of appetizers. Frank watched them from his armchair, the patriarch observing his domain, and felt the first prickle of unease. He'd seen crews on a job site with this kind of tension right before a mistake was made, a miscalculation, a cut corner. At the table, the disconnect was palpable. The roast sat perfectly cooked on its platter, yet the atmosphere was cold. Frank's questions about the progress on the Halcyon Tower project, their company's biggest contract to date, were met with clipped, evasive answers. "Everything's on track, Frank." "Don't you worry," Leo said, sawing at his meat with unnecessary force. "Mark?" "The materials invoices looked a little heavy last month," Frank pressed gently. Mark flinched, dropping his fork with a clatter. "Supply chain issues. Prices are up everywhere, Dad. You know that." He wouldn't meet Frank's eyes, focusing instead on calming Chloe, who was building a precarious fortress out of mashed potatoes. The conversation withered. The silence that filled the gaps was heavy, thick with unspoken things. Frank felt a weariness settle into his bones, a feeling that had nothing to do with his age and everything to do with the strained performance unfolding at his own table. He almost dismissed it, almost wrote it off as the stress of a demanding job. Almost. Then, into the lull, Chloe's small, clear voice spiked up, directed at him. "Grandpa, I saw a new building today." Frank smiled, grateful for the innocent distraction. "Oh yeah, sweetie. What kind of building?" "It was Daddy and Uncle Leo's secret new office," she announced proudly. "It has a big glass wall, and you can see all the cars. Daddy said I couldn't tell you because it's a big, big surprise for you, but I'm not good at secrets." The air in the room didn't just go silent, it seemed to vanish, sucked out by a vacuum. Maria froze, her wine glass halfway to her lips. Mark's face went chalk white, a stark contrast to the sudden, angry flush creeping up Leo's neck. Leo was the first to recover, forcing a laugh that sounded like grinding gears. "Out of the mouths of babes, huh, Frank?" He winked, a desperate, hollow gesture. "Mark and I were just scouting a little spot. For planning your retirement gift. This one just can't keep a secret." He playfully ruffled Chloe's hair. Mark said nothing. He just stared at his daughter, his expression a complicated mess of panic and something that looked horribly like regret. He quickly began clearing plates, his movements jerky and loud. Frank leaned back in his chair, the solid oak suddenly feeling like a fragile prop. He smiled, a slow, deliberate expression that didn't reach his eyes. A surprise? For me. He said, his voice calm and steady. Well, you two shouldn't have. He picked up his carving knife, the steel cool and solid in his grip. But as he looked from his son's pale face to his brother's false smile, he knew. The secret wasn't a gift. It was a weapon. And it was being sharpened right here at his table. The last of the Sunday dinner dishes had been washed and put away, the house settling into a deep and unnerving quiet. Maria had gone to bed, her fatigue a shield against the tension that still clung to the air like a bitter cologne. But Frank couldn't rest. The image of his son's panicked face, his brother's false laugh, played on a loop in his mind, underscored by the echo of his granddaughter's innocent words, a secret new office. It was a splinter under the skin, a dissonance he couldn't ignore. Sleep was impossible. He grabbed his keys from the bowl by the door and drove through the deserted streets to the one place where things still made sense, the office. The headquarters of Valor Construction was a 2-story brick building Frank had designed himself. It was his fortress, a testament to decades of sweat and shrewd decisions. Inside, the familiar scent of sawdust, blueprints, and brewed coffee was a comfort. Everything had its place. His desk was clear except for a stack of invoices he'd review in the morning. The architectural plans for the new municipal center were neatly rolled and stored. He ran a hand over the smooth, cool surface of the oak conference table he'd built with Mark when the boy was just 16. Order. Logic. This was the world he understood. He walked past his son's and his brother's offices to the archive room at the back. It was a small, climate-controlled space lined with industrial-grade shelving. Here, the lifeblood of the company was chronicled in thick, color-coded binders and ledgers. Each project, from a simple residential remodel to a complex commercial build, had its own physical record. He trusted technology, but he believed in paper. Paper couldn't be deleted with a keystroke. His eyes scanned the shelf dedicated to their current flagship project, the Halcyon Tower. He knew the placement of each volume by heart. And one was wrong. The primary project ledger, a heavy, green-bound book nearly 4 inches thick, was misaligned. It sat a 1/4 of an inch further back than its neighbors, its spine not quite flush with the others. It was a detail so minor no one else would ever notice. But to Frank, it was like finding a load-bearing wall moved without his say-so. He pulled the heavy volume from the shelf. The spine felt looser, the binding slightly strained, as if it had recently been forced flat. He carried it to his desk, the weight of it familiar yet somehow alien. He switched on his desk lamp, the focused pool of light illuminating the textured cover. There was no dust on it, unlike the faint layer on the ones beside it. He opened it, and the smell hit him first, not the musty, comfortable scent of old paper and ink, but the faint, sharp smell of ozone and heat. The sterile, chemical tang of a high-capacity photocopier. His fingers, calloused from a lifetime of work, traced the edges of the pages. They felt different. Less crisp. He looked closer, angling the book under the light. Near the spine, on the first few dozen pages detailing material outlays and subcontractor payments, he saw a faint, almost imperceptible sheen, the kind of electrostatic ghosting left behind by a powerful scanner or copier. Someone had taken this book and duplicated its contents. The entire financial core of his most important project. The following morning, Frank was at his desk an hour before anyone else arrived, the green ledger sitting squarely in the center of his blotter. When Mark came in, coffee in hand, Frank called him. Shut the door. Mark's easy morning demeanor evaporated. He stood hesitantly in front of the desk, his eyes immediately locking onto the ledger. Something wrong, Dad? Did you need the Halcyon ledger this weekend? Frank asked, his voice even, betraying nothing. A flicker of panic crossed Mark's face before being suppressed. Yeah, I did. Brought it home Saturday. Just wanted to get ahead on the quarterly projections. The lie was smooth, but too quick. I see, Frank said, leaning back in his chair. You brought it back Sunday. Sunday afternoon, Mark confirmed, his posture stiffening. Why? Did I put it back wrong? He tried for a casual laugh. Guess I was in a rush to get to dinner. Frank didn't smile. He tapped a single finger on the Ledger S cover. It's a heavy book, Mark. To copy. Mark's face paled. Copy? I didn't copy anything. I was just reading the figures. It smells like a copier, Frank stated, not as an accusation, but as a fact. Like observing that the sky was blue. And it's been handled roughly. Forced flat. He paused, letting the silence stretch. You and I both know the only copier strong enough to handle a bound book this thick is the industrial machine over at Apex Legal. His son's composure finally fractured. I don't know what you're talking about, Mark stammered, his gaze darting toward the door. Maybe you're just getting confused. It was probably one of the accounting staff on Friday. Frank's heart felt like a cold stone in his chest. The clumsy deflection, the subtle suggestion of his own incompetence, it was more damning than a confession. He had spent his life teaching his son the value of a straight line and a solid foundation. And here his son was, trying to build a lie on shifting sand. All right, Mark, Frank said quietly, his voice hollow. That'll be all. Mark practically fled the room. Frank sat alone, the silence of the office pressing in. The unease from Sunday dinner had now cooled and hardened into a terrible, undeniable certainty. The splinter was no longer under his skin, it was working its way toward his heart. For 2 days, Frank moved through his company like a ghost. He attended meetings, signed paperwork, and inspected job sites, his actions a hollow pantomime of his former self. The familiar rhythms of his life's work offered no comfort, only a constant, grinding reminder of the lie festering within its heart. Every polite good morning, Frank from his brother, every project update from his son, felt like another shovelful of dirt on a freshly dug grave. He was being buried in his own company, and he couldn't shake the feeling that his own blood held the shovels. The hope that he was wrong, that it was all a terrible misunderstanding, was a flickering candle flame against the gathering storm. By Wednesday afternoon, the flame was nearly extinguished. He picked up his personal cell phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. Sarah Chen's office was the antithesis of his own. Where Frank's world was built of wood, steel, and concrete, hers was one of glass, chrome, and the silent hum of servers. She was a forensic accountant, a woman who excavated truths from the bedrock of balance sheets. Her handshake was as firm as his own, her eyes missing nothing. Frank, she said, gesturing to a chair opposite her surgically clean desk. You look like you've seen a ghost. I might have, he replied, his voice rougher than he intended. In my books. He didn't bring the physical ledger, that would have been too risky. Instead, he laid out the events of the past week with the weary precision of a man detailing a structural failure. He spoke of the tension at dinner, his granddaughter's innocent words, the displaced ledger, and Mark's clumsy, painful lie. He avoided using the words stealing or conspiracy. He framed it as a series of irregularities he couldn't explain, a foundation that had developed cracks. He was handing her a problem to solve, not an accusation to prove. Sarah listened without interruption, her fingers steepled, her expression unreadable. When he finished, the silence in the room felt absolute. You're asking me to audit your own son and brother, she stated, her voice devoid of judgment. It wasn't a question. Discreetly. Frank nodded, the motion feeling heavy, final. I need to know what's in the dark, Sarah. Even if I don't like what I find. More than anything, I want you to find nothing. I want you to call me next week and tell me I'm a paranoid old man. A flicker of something, sympathy, perhaps, crossed her face. And if you're not? She asked gently. Once this process starts, Frank, it doesn't stop. Are you prepared for where it might lead? He thought of Chloe's bright, trusting face. He thought of the decades of sweat he'd poured into building something that was meant to be hers one day. "I'm prepared to protect my company," he said, the words tasting like ash. "Whatever it takes." That night, well after midnight, Frank sat at his home computer and granted Sarah the remote access she needed. He watched the cursor on his screen move independently as she bypassed the standard user interface and entered the system's backend, a digital specter slipping through firewalls he had paid his son to erect. He felt a profound sense of violation, as if he were helping a stranger pick the locks to his own house. He closed the laptop and tried to sleep, but found no rest. 2 more days passed. The silence from Sarah was a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety. Then, late Friday evening, his personal phone lit up. "I have something," Sarah's voice was crisp, all business. "It's not a smoking gun. It's a thread. A very strange one." Frank sat down heavily in his armchair. "Go on." "There's a shell vendor in the system, Trident Logistical Solutions. They've been receiving monthly payments for the last 8 months, coded to the Halcyon project. The payments are for expedited material sourcing and consultation." "I've never heard of them," Frank said, his knuckles white on the armrest. "I approve every new vendor, every major materials contract. Especially for Halcyon." "I know," Sarah said. "That's the first thing I checked. Your digital signature isn't key on any of the authorizations. Mark's is. But here's the ghost in the machine, Frank. The invoices from Trident are immaculate. Perfect. Too perfect. And the company itself was incorporated 9 months ago. Its registered address is a P.O. box, and its director is a name I can't find in any public database. It's a phantom." Frank closed his eyes. The last ember of hope, the one that whispered of misunderstandings and paranoia, went cold. A phantom company, authorized by his son, draining money from his legacy. The cracks had suspected weren't just cracks. They were deliberate, chiseled holes in the foundation, and he was only just beginning to see how deep they went. Knowledge was a poison. Since Sarah's discovery of the phantom company, everything familiar had become tainted. The morning coffee Maria made for him, the familiar heft of his truck's steering wheel, the cheerful greeting from his son at the office, it was all now layered with a sickening film of deceit. Frank found himself watching, listening, analyzing every word and gesture from Mark and Leo. He was no longer a father and a brother, he was a silent observer in his own life, cataloging evidence for a trial that hadn't yet been declared. His home, the sanctuary he had built with his own hands, now felt like a listening post. He feigned exhaustion, blaming his age with a knowing irony, and started spending more time in his home study, the door left slightly ajar. He needed to understand the full scope of the battlefield before he made his first move. The financial bleed was one thing, a cancer he could now locate. But he sensed the disease ran deeper. The first confirmation came on a Saturday afternoon. The sun was warm, and the scent of freshly cut grass drifted in through the open patio door. Mark was outside, pacing as he spoke on his phone, his voice a low, urgent murmur. He thought he was alone. Frank sat motionless in the dim study, his newspaper untouched in his lap. "No, listen to me. The liquidity is the key," Mark said, his back to the house. "We need to shift the primary assets from the Valor accounts before the quarterly review. Another 2 weeks. Once they're parked in the Trident holding, they're clean. Dad won't even see the transfer until it's too late." A pause. "Don't worry about him. He's slowing down. He barely looks at the detailed manifests anymore." Frank's blood ran cold. Slowing down. Won't even see it. It wasn't just theft, it was predicated on his decline, on their contempt for his mind. He listened as his son discussed the logistics of moving capital he had bled for, speaking of it as if it were just numbers on a screen, detached from the decades of risk and labor that gave them substance. The conversation ended, and a moment later, Mark walked inside, smiling as he saw Frank in the chair. Hey, Dad. Just catching up on some work stuff. You need anything? The ease of the lie was breathtaking. Frank simply shook his head, folding his newspaper with deliberate, steady hands. Just resting my eyes, he said, his voice a gravelly calm he did not feel. The final piece, the one that shattered any remaining sentiment, fell into place 2 nights later. Leo had come over, ostensibly to watch the game, but he spent most of the time on his phone on the back porch. Frank was in the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water, when he heard his brother's voice, sharp and clinical, slice through the screen door. The doctor's testimony will be crucial, of course, Leo said. We've been documenting it for months. His forgetfulness, misplacing things, the general confusion. Minor lapses, but the pattern is clear. Frank stopped breathing, the glass cold against his palm. He knew Leo was talking to a lawyer. We need to frame it as a protective measure. We're his family. We're stepping in to protect his legacy before he makes a catastrophic error. A long pause hung in the night air. Yes, full power of attorney, Leo confirmed, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Medical and financial. Once that's secured, we can restructure the company's leadership and ownership without his interference. It's the cleanest way. For his own good, you understand. For his own good. The paternalistic venom of the phrase struck Frank with the force of a physical blow. They weren't just stealing his money. They were stealing his life, his mind, his very authority over himself. They were going to have him declared incompetent, a relic to be managed, while they dismantled everything he had ever built. The chill that had started in his heart now spread through his entire body, a glacial freeze of pure, clarifying rage. But it was a silent rage, a pressure building behind the dam. He stepped back from the door, melting into the shadows of the hallway before Leo could see him. He stood there for a long time, the house he built now a foreign country. The pictures on the wall of his smiling son, of a younger, trusting version of his brother, were artifacts from a life that was no longer his. The betrayal was absolute. It was no longer about money. It was about survival. The meeting with Sarah took place in a sterile, anonymous conference room at a downtown hotel, a neutral ground where no ghosts of family lingered. Frank had requested it. He couldn't bear to hear the full confession of his family's sins within the walls of his home or his company. Sarah sat opposite him, a slim laptop open before her. Between them, on the polished table, was a single, thick manila folder. It looked innocuous, but Frank knew it contained the detailed autopsy of his life's work. It's worse than we thought, Frank, she began, her voice soft but unsparing. She turned the laptop toward him. On the screen was a complex flowchart, a spiderweb of transactions, shell corporations, and wire transfers. Trident Logistical Solutions was just the tip of the spear. She walked him through it with methodical precision. The embezzlement wasn't a simple act of skimming profits. It was a sophisticated, multi-layered operation. Leo, with his business acumen, had designed the corporate architecture. Mark, with his intimate knowledge of the company's internal controls, had executed it. They had created not one, but 3 interconnected shell companies, each designed to perform a specific function, one for fraudulent invoicing, another to hold the siphoned capital, and a third to purchase company assets, equipment, vehicles, even small parcels of land, at a fraction of their value. They've funneled just over $1.8 million in the last 10 months, Sarah said, pointing to a final figure at the bottom of a spreadsheet. The number hung in the air, clinical and obscene. But the money isn't their endgame, Frank. It's just the fuel. Frank felt a strange detachment, as if he were reviewing the structural flaws in someone else's failed project. The pain was so vast it had become a dull, systemic ache, leaving his mind clear and cold. What is the endgame? He asked, his voice steady. Sarah closed the laptop and pushed the manila folder across the table. This is what they bought with your money. Frank opened it. The first document was a copy of a signed lease agreement. It was for a large, modern office space with a glass wall overlooking the city, Chloe's secret new office. The name on the lease was for a company he'd never seen before, Apex Construction Group. The signatories were Leo and Mark. He flipped the page. Next were incorporation documents for Apex, filed 6 months ago. The business plan was laid out in cold, corporate language to acquire and absorb the assets of a distressed regional competitor. He felt a bitter laugh rise in his throat. That competitor was him. But the final documents were the most chilling. They were drafts of legal petitions, emails between his brother and a law firm specializing in elder law. Sarah had, through means Frank didn't ask about, acquired the full correspondence. He read the words his own brother had written. My brother's cognitive decline is accelerating. We're worried he'll liquidate key assets on a whim. A pattern of erratic behavior. They were building a case, brick by painstaking brick, to have him stripped of his own mind in the eyes of the law. They were documenting every time he misplaced his keys, every name he momentarily forgot, twisting the normalcies of aging into a portrait of senility. The full scope of their treachery was now laid bare, a blueprint for total annihilation. It was a three-pronged attack. First, bleed Valor construction of its operating capital, weakening it from the inside. Second, use that stolen capital to build a new, rival company, Apex, poised to take over. And third, the final, brutal stroke, have Frank declared mentally incompetent, securing power of attorney to facilitate the merger and seize a lifetime of work without a fight. They wouldn't just take his company, they would erase him from it, recasting his life story as the sad final chapter of a failing old man saved by his benevolent family. Frank closed the folder. The room was silent. The dull ache was gone, replaced by a profound, unnerving calm. He finally saw the full design. It was elegant in its cruelty, comprehensive in its betrayal. He looked at Sarah, his eyes clear and hard as granite. Davy made one mistake, he said, his voice quiet but resonant. What is that? They think I'm the man they're describing in those papers, he replied. Davy been so busy writing my ending, they've forgotten I'm the one who taught them how to build. The grief came later that night, a silent, solitary wave that broke in the darkness of his study. It was a cold, desolate sorrow for the family he thought he had, for the son he had raised and the brother he had trusted. But like a fever, it burned itself out, leaving behind not weakness, but a hard, tempered resolve. By morning, the pain had crystallized into purpose. He was no longer a victim waiting for the next blow to fall. He was a builder, and his family had drafted a blueprint for his ruin. Now, he would draw his own. His first call was not to the police, but to Elena Morales. Elena was a corporate lawyer with a reputation for being as unyielding as the steel frames of the skyscrapers her clients built. Her office, on the 40th floor of one such tower, had a panoramic view of the city Frank had helped shape. It was a fitting place to plan its defense. He, Sarah, and Elena met in a conference room that felt more like a command center. Frank laid out the manila folder from Sarah on the vast mahogany table. He didn't speak of betrayal or family. He presented the situation as a hostile takeover, an internal conspiracy to defraud and dismantle a solvent company. He was methodical, his voice even, detailing the shell corporations, the embezzled funds, and the legal strategy to declare him incompetent. Elena listened, her eyes sharp and focused, absorbing every detail. Sarah stood by a whiteboard, ready to diagram the complex financial web she had uncovered. There was no shock or melodrama in the room, only the cold, quiet hum of professionals assessing a problem. When Frank finished, Elena looked not at the documents, but at him. Frank, what is your objective? Do you want to punish them? Do you want to recover the money? Do you want to send your son and your brother to prison? The question was a scalpel, cutting to the heart of the matter. Petty revenge would be easy. A single call to the district attorney would ignite a firestorm that would consume them all, Leo, Mark, and the company he had spent his life building. But that wasn't justice. It was just more destruction. My objective is to protect my legacy, Frank stated, his gaze unwavering. Valor Construction will not fail. It will not be stolen. The money they took will be returned. And they will face the consequences of their actions. But I will not burn down my own house to get rid of the rats. A slow smile touched Alina's lips. Good. Rage is a clumsy instrument. We'll use a surgeon's knife. For the next 4 hours, they worked. It was the most intense and focused period of construction Frank had ever been a part of. But this time, they weren't building with steel and concrete, they were building a fortress of law and finance. Sarah whiteboarded the flow of stolen money, tracing every transaction back to its source. Elena, in response, began to draft the legal instruments to claw it all back. The plan they formulated was not a single, explosive confrontation, but a series of precise, cascading actions. It was a counter-blueprint designed to dismantle Leo and Mark's conspiracy from the foundation up. First, Elena would draft ex-parte motions to be filed simultaneously. One would seek a temporary restraining order and a freeze on all assets, personal and corporate, associated with Leo, Mark, and their shell companies, including Apex Construction Group. The evidence Sarah had compiled was overwhelming, no judge would deny it. This would cut off their access to the stolen capital instantly. Second, they would file a civil suit alleging fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy. The lawsuit would seek not just the return of the $1.8 million, but punitive damages that would financially cripple them. Third, and this was Frank's own contribution, they would target the operational structure. While Elena tied them up in court, Frank would neutralize their ability to function. Their new company, Apex, was just a name on paper. To actually build anything, they would need suppliers, subcontractors, and credit lines, all of which were intertwined with Frank's own decades-long relationships in the industry. They have a name and a bank account full of my money, Frank explained, his voice hard. But they don't have the goodwill. They don't have the reputation. I do. As the plan solidified, Frank felt a grim sense of empowerment. He was not acting out of uncontrolled rage. He was moving with the cold, calculated precision of a master craftsman. He was defending his life's work, protecting the future for his granddaughter that his son had tried to steal. The cost would be immense, a family shattered beyond repair. But the alternative, to stand by and be erased, was no alternative at all. Elena gathered her notes. This will be a quiet war, Frank. Fought in court filings and bank notices. They won't see the army until their city is already under siege. Frank nodded. They thought I was an old man, slowing down. They're about to find out what happens when you try to tear down a building while the architect is still inside. While Elena sharpened her legal knives in the sterile high-rises downtown, Frank began his own offensive in the dusty lots and noisy workshops where the real work of the city was done. A company like Apex Construction Group might exist on paper, but it couldn't lay a single yard of concrete or raise a single steel beam without a network of support. Leo and Mark had the stolen capital, but Frank possessed something far more valuable and much harder to acquire: a lifetime of trust. He was about to call in his accounts. He started with a phone call to a man named Gus, who owned the largest concrete supply company in the state. Frank had given Gus his first big contract 30 years ago, when Gus was just a young man with 2 used trucks and a mountain of debt. They hadn't just done business, they had helped each other build empires. Gus, it's Frank, he said, standing in his quiet workshop at home, the scent of which shavings a familiar comfort. Frank. Good to hear your voice. What can I do for you? You need a priority pour for the halcyon site? No, nothing like that, Frank said, his voice level. I'm calling about a new outfit. Apex Construction Group. Have they reached out to you? There was a brief pause on the other end. As a matter of fact, they have. Put in a big query yesterday. Aggressive timeline, wanted to lock in supply for a project they haven't even landed yet. Leo's name was on it. I figured it was some new venture of yours. This was the moment. Frank chose his words with the care of a man cutting a crucial support beam. Gus, it's not with me. It's a hostile play. Leo and my son are trying to make a move on Valor. He let that sink in, offering no further drama or detail. The silence on the other end stretched, thick with understanding. Gus was a man who, like Frank, had built his business on handshakes and his word. He understood the language of loyalty and betrayal better than any lawyer. Well, Gus finally said, his voice now a low rumble. That's a damn shame. Tell you what, Frank. My supply schedule just got real tight for the foreseeable future. I don't think I'll have a spare yard of concrete for any Apex group for a long, long time. I appreciate that, Gus, Frank said simply. Don't mention it, Gus replied. Some debts don't get paid with money. It was the first of a dozen such calls and meetings over the next week. He met with the head of the electricians' union, a man whose father Frank had personally helped get sober and back on his feet. He had coffee with the owner of the region's primary heavy equipment rental company, to whom he had once extended a 6-month line of credit during a downturn, saving her business from bankruptcy. He spoke with his steel supplier, his chief architect, and the head of the drywall crew he'd used exclusively for 2 decades. He never raised his voice, never spoke of his pain. He presented the situation in stark, simple terms: an internal threat, a betrayal of trust, an attempt to build a new house with stolen tools. He didn't ask for favors directly. He simply laid out the facts and let them draw their own conclusions. He was cashing in on a currency he had been accumulating for 40 years' goodwill. The response was unanimous and immediate. It was an unspoken code among the old guard, the men and women who had built the city with their own hands. You didn't steal from family, and you didn't betray the man who had helped you lay your own foundation. By the end of the week, Frank had quietly and systematically erected a silent wall around Apex Construction Group. When Leo and Mark made their calls, they would be met with polite regrets. Schedules were full. Equipment was already allocated. Credit applications would be mysteriously slow-walked. They had a company in name only, an engine with no fuel, no wheels, and no road to drive on. Their stolen money could buy them a fancy office with a glass wall, but it couldn't buy them a single bag of cement or an hour of a master electrician's time. He had effectively cut their operational lifelines before they even knew they were in a fight. It was a cold, precise act of strategic sabotage, executed not with anger, but with the quiet authority of his own history. They had built their plan in the shadows, and he was now ensuring they would never be able to bring it into the light. The phone call to Mark was the hardest part of the plan. Frank stood in his kitchen, the afternoon sun warming the familiar wooden floorboards, and dialed his son's number. He forced a weariness into his voice, a slight hesitation between his words, crafting the perfect portrait of the man they believed him to be. Mark, he said, his voice a little rough. Your mother wants to have everyone over for Sunday dinner. The usual. You think you can all make it? Of course, Dad, Mark's reply was quick, perhaps too quick. We'll be there. Is everything okay? You sound tired. Frank let out a sigh he had been practicing. Just a long week, son. A long few years, maybe. We'll talk on Sunday. He hung up before Mark could ask more questions. The performance had begun. That Sunday, the house felt like a stage set. The aroma of roast beef once again filled the air, but this time it was not a scent of comfort, but a tool of misdirection. Maria, bless her heart, knew something was deeply wrong, but she didn't know the specifics. Frank had only told her that he was handling a serious internal problem at the company and that he needed her, just this once, to trust him and follow his lead. The worry in her eyes was real, which made the entire scene all the more convincing. Leo and Mark arrived together, radiating a barely concealed energy. It was the nervous excitement of gamblers who believed they held a winning hand. They exchanged a look when they saw him, a quick, conspiratorial glance that confirmed they were seeing what they wanted to see. Frank was slumped in his favorite armchair, looking older than his years, a half-empty glass of scotch resting on the side table. He offered them a weak smile. Dinner was a masterclass in manipulation. Frank played his part to perfection. He was forgetful, repeating an anecdote he'd told just 10 minutes prior. He seemed distracted, asking vague questions about the Halcyon project and appearing not to register their clipped, non-committal answers. He complained about his joints, the ever-increasing complexity of the business, the exhaustion of it all. "You know," he said, swirling the wine in his glass and staring into its dark red depths. "I've been thinking a lot about retirement. For real this time." The air at the table shifted. The tension that had defined their last dinner here was replaced by a sharp, predatory stillness. Leo and Mark exchanged another look, this one gleaming with triumph. The fish was not only taking the bait, it was swimming eagerly toward the hook. "It's just too much now," Frank continued, shaking his head with a convincing air of defeat. "The digital accounting, the new zoning regulations, it's a young man's game." "Your game." He looked from his son to his brother. "I built the foundation, but maybe it's time for new architects to finish the house." Leo leaned forward, placing his fork down with deliberate care. "Frank, we've always said, whenever you're ready, we're here to take the weight off your shoulders. The most important thing is your health." The feigned sincerity was so thick Frank could have cut it with his steak knife. Mark chimed in, his voice layered with false concern. "Dad, you've earned your rest. You've done more than enough. Maybe it's time you and Mom took that trip to Italy you've always talked about." Even Chloe seemed to sense the performance. She was unusually quiet, watching her grandfather with wide, curious eyes. Frank met her gaze for a brief second and offered a tiny, almost imperceptible wink. He let the conversation drift, allowing them to fill the silence with their plans, couched in the language of concern. They talked about streamlining operations and modernizing the business model. They were, in effect, describing the mission of Apex Construction right at his dinner table, confident that the old man was too tired and defeated to see the truth. As the evening wound down, Frank stood up, leaning on the table for support. "I'm glad we had this talk," he said, his voice heavy with manufactured emotion. I think I'm ready. Let us meet at the office on Monday morning, say, 10 o'clock. The three of us. We can have the lawyers start drawing up the transition papers." Victory was shining in their eyes. It was absolute and blinding. They saw a broken old man surrendering his kingdom. They saw the culmination of their meticulous planning, the final, easy step in a long campaign. They clapped him on the shoulder, their touch patronizing, their smiles wide and genuine for the first time all evening. After they left, the silence they left behind was profound. Maria came and stood beside him, her hand on his arm. "Frank. What was that? Are you really?" He straightened up, the stoop in his shoulders vanishing, the weariness in his eyes replaced by a hard, clear light. He looked out the window at the taillights of his son's car disappearing down the street. "No, Maria," he said, his voice low and firm. "I'm not retiring." He turned to her, his expression grim but resolute. "I'm going to war." Monday dawned bright and clear, a perfect day for a coronation. At least, that's how it felt to Leo and Mark as they rode the elevator up to their new office. The victory from the previous night was a palpable energy between them, a shared, smug satisfaction. Frank's performance of a defeated old man had been utterly convincing. The kingdom was theirs for the taking. The 10 a.m. meeting at the old office was a mere formality, the signing of the surrender. They stepped into the sprawling, sunlit space of Apex Construction Group. The minimalist furniture was still wrapped in plastic, the glass walls gleaming. It was the physical manifestation of their ambition, paid for with the capital of the past to build their future. "I'll call Gus about that preliminary concrete order," Leo said, pulling out his phone. "Might as well get the ball rolling before we even meet with the old man." Mark grinned, walking to the floor-to-ceiling window and looking down at the city below. He made it so easy, he said, shaking his head in disbelief. All that bluster for years, and he just falls. He's old, Mark. We saw it coming, Leo said dismissively. This isn't a betrayal. It's a succession. As he said the word, the glass door to the office suite swished open. A man in a crisp, unassuming suit stood there, holding a thick leather briefcase. He wasn't a delivery person or a building manager. He had the quiet, unmovable presence of a man with an unpleasant job to do. Leonard and Mark Valeriano? The man asked, his voice flat. Leo lowered his phone. Yes. Can we help you? The man stepped forward and placed two identical, thick stacks of documents on the sleek reception desk. You've both been served. He gave a clipped, professional nod and was gone before either of them could fully process his words. For a moment, they just stared at the paperwork. Mark cautiously picked up the top page of his stack. The language was dense, impenetrable legalese, but certain phrases leaked out: temporary restraining order, ex parte motion, asset seizure. Leo, quicker to grasp the implications, snatched the documents from his nephew's hand, his eyes scanning the pages with rapidly dawning horror. This is from Elena Morales, he whispered, the color draining from his face. Frank's lawyer. What is it? Mark asked, his voice tight with confusion. It's an injunction. She's frozen everything, Leo's voice cracked. He read from a page, his tone incredulous. All personal and corporate accounts associated with us, Trident Logistical, our other holding companies and Apex Construction Group. Effective as of 8 a.m. this morning. The beautiful, sunlit office suddenly felt like a cage. The stunning view of the city seemed to mock them. That's not possible, Mark stammered, fumbling for his wallet. He doesn't know. He pulled out the Apex corporate credit card, the plastic still pristine. He logged into the company's online banking portal on his phone, his hands shaking. The balance, which on Friday had been over $1 million, now read $0. A small, red banner at the top of the screen blinked with two words: account frozen by court order. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. Leo was already dialing his phone, his bravado from minutes earlier replaced by a raw, snarling urgency. Gus, it's Leo Valeriano. What do you mean your schedule is full? For 6 months. That's insane. He disconnected, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. He won't sell to us. He dialed another number. Jim. It's Leo. No, I don't care what your allocation sheet says, we need the heavy equipment. A pause. What do you mean our credit application was denied? One by one, the calls were made. One by one, the doors were politely but firmly shut. The wall Frank had built around them was invisible but absolute. Their suppliers, their contacts, their entire operational network, it had all vanished overnight. They were standing in a multi-million-dollar shell, a ghost of a company with frozen funds and no ability to conduct a single dollar's worth of business. Sarah's audit, referenced in meticulous detail throughout the injunction, was the cannonball that had breached their walls, and Frank's network was the army now pouring through the gap. The scheme, so elegant and cruel in its design, had been dismantled with a silent, devastating precision they had never imagined possible. The 10 a.m. meeting to accept their father's surrender came and went. They were still standing in their glass prison, the damning legal documents spread out like a death shroud on the desk, their phones silent. Their carefully plotted future had imploded before it had even begun. The summons came from Elena, not from Frank. It was a cold, formal request for a mandatory settlement conference. The location was not the worn, familiar territory of the Valor construction offices, but the 40th floor conference room at Elena's firm, a place of neutral, unforgiving clarity. Leo and Mark arrived looking haggard, their tailored suits seeming to hang off them. 2 days of frozen accounts and unanswered calls had stripped them of their manufactured confidence, leaving behind a raw, desperate anger. They were accompanied by their own lawyer, a man who looked distinctly uncomfortable, like he had been handed a losing case and knew it. Frank was already there, seated at the head of the long, mahogany table. He was not flanked by his lawyer. He sat alone, a picture of calm authority. He wore a simple, dark suit, looking not like a victim, but like a chairman of the board about to conduct a difficult but necessary piece of business. The man they had dismissed as a fading relic was gone. In his place was the man who had built an empire from nothing, and he looked them both dead in the eye as they entered. There were no pleasantries. No handshakes. Leo and Mark took their seats opposite him, the vast, polished expanse of the table a chasm between them. Elena began, her voice crisp and professional. We are here today to discuss the civil suit filed by my client against Mr. Leonard Valeriano and Mr. Mark Valeriano for the charges of fraud, conspiracy, and breach of fiduciary duty. The evidence, as I'm sure your counsel has reviewed, is comprehensive. Mark flinched at the word fraud. Leo, however, leaned forward, his face a mask of indignation. This is a family matter, a misunderstanding that's been blown out of proportion. Frank held up a hand, and a simple gesture silenced his brother more effectively than a shout. This was his meeting. He would control the narrative. There is no misunderstanding, Leo, Frank said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute finality. He slid 3 identical folders across the table. Each one contained a condensed version of Sarah's report, the flowcharts of stolen money, the incorporation papers for Apex, copies of the fraudulent invoices, and, most damningly, the printouts of the emails detailing the plan to have him declared incompetent. You stole $1.8 million from the company I built, Frank stated, not with anger, but with the cold, hard clarity of an auditor reading a final tally. You used that money to build a parasitic company designed to bleed this one dry. And you conspired with a lawyer to have me stripped of my rights, to have me declared a non-person, so you could finish the job. He let the words hang in the sterile air. Mark stared down at the tabletop, unable to look at his father. Leo's face hardened, his jaw tight. Dad, it wasn't like that, Mark began, his voice barely a whisper. We were just trying to secure the future. Frank's gaze settled on his son, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than cold resolve showed in his eyes, a deep, weary sadness. Secure the future. By destroying the past. By trying to have me committed. Whose future were you securing, Mark? He didn't wait for an answer. He turned his attention back to both of them. The civil suit will proceed. Elena will recover every dollar you stole, plus damages. Valor Construction will be made whole. But that is a separate issue from what we are here to discuss. He paused, letting the weight of his next words gather. This morning, at my instruction, Elena delivered a full and complete copy of this evidence to the district attorney's office, he announced. I am pressing for full criminal charges. Grand larceny. Conspiracy to commit fraud. Elder abuse. Their lawyer's head snapped up. Leo went rigid, his knuckles white where he gripped the table. Mark made a small, choked sound. This went beyond a business dispute. This was ruin. You wouldn't, Leo hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. You would send your own family to prison. Frank looked at him, his expression unchanging. You stopped being my family when you drafted the legal documents to have me put away. You made a business decision. This is my business decision. He stood up, the meeting effectively over. Your shares in Valor Construction are forfeit as part of the civil settlement. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. You will be escorted to the office to collect your personal belongings, and then you will never set foot on company property again. He walked to the door, his back straight, his steps even. He did not look back. He did not need to see the shattered looks on their faces. He had built something, and they had tried to tear it down. The severance was complete. It wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of survival. A necessary, painful amputation to save the whole. It was Sunday again. 6 weeks had passed since the final meeting, 6 weeks in which the legal and financial machinery had ground on with inexorable force. The civil suit was settled, the stolen money returned to Valor's accounts. The district attorney, armed with an airtight case, was proceeding with the criminal charges. Frank's company was secure, purged of the rot that had been festering within. His name was clear. By every measure, he had won. But on this Sunday, there was no smell of roast beef in the house. The oak dining table, which he had so often extended to accommodate the boisterous energy of his family, was now set with only 2 plates, one at each end, for him and Maria. The leaf of the table was back in storage. The house felt too big, the silence too loud. He sat at the head of the table, his customary place, and stared at the empty chairs. The ghosts of past dinners were more present than ever. He could see Leo, gesturing emphatically as he described a new business deal. He could see Mark, laughing at something Chloe had said, his face open and unburdened by deceit. He could hear his granddaughter's small, clear voice, the innocent catalyst for it all. The victory had been precise and absolute, but it had come at the cost of a limb. He had saved the body, but the phantom pain of the amputation was a constant, dull ache. Maria brought their plates to the table, her movements quiet, her smile gentle but tinged with a shared sadness. They ate in a quiet companionship that needed no words. They had each other, and for that, he was profoundly grateful. But the space once filled by a son and a brother was a void that could not be ignored. His daughter-in-law, Sarah, had left Mark. She had brought Chloe over to see him and Maria twice, small, supervised visits in the neutral territory of a public park. During the last visit, Chloe had looked up at him with her father's eyes and asked, "Grandpa, why is Daddy sad?" He had knelt down, the joints in his knees protesting, and looked into her innocent face. How could he explain the complexities of greed and betrayal to a 6-year-old? How could he tell her that the men she loved had tried to destroy the man she was named for? "Sometimes, sweetie," he had said, his voice thick, "grown-ups make big mistakes. And those mistakes have big consequences." It was the truest, most inadequate answer he could give. After dinner, he sat in his study, a glass of scotch untouched on his desk. He looked at the framed photo on the credenza. It was from a decade ago, taken at the completion of a major project. He stood in the middle, his arms around the shoulders of a younger Mark and a beaming Leo. They were a team. A family. Builders. He had thought their foundation was solid, built on bedrock. He had been wrong. It was built on sand, and the tide had come in. There was no joy in this victory, only a grim, necessary satisfaction. He hadn't acted out of rage or a thirst for vengeance. He had acted as he always had when faced with a threat to one of his structures. He had assessed the damage, drawn up a new plan, and reinforced the foundation. It was a defensive act. He had protected his life's work, his legacy, and the future he was building for Chloe. But in saving the structure, he had been forced to condemn a part of his own heart. He picked up the phone and dialed. "Elena? It's Frank. I want to set up a trust for Chloe. A significant one. But I want it structured so the funds are untouchable by anyone, including her parents, until she is 25. He was still building. He was shoring up the future, laying a new foundation for the only part of his family that remained untainted. The work was all he had left. The justice he had secured was real and legitimate, but it was a cold comfort in a quiet house. He had won the war, but the cost was a peace he would likely never feel again. The table was safe, but it would forever be a table set for one. In the end, the carving knife at that Sunday dinner was never the real weapon the betrayal was. Frank's story is a difficult reminder that true justice isn't always a celebration, but often a quiet, painful reckoning. To protect a lifetime of work, he had to dismantle a part of his own heart, proving that sometimes the heaviest price of victory is paid in the silence of an empty chair. We hope this story resonated with you here on Content Channel. It raises so many complex questions about family and business. In that final severance meeting, do you believe Frank was right to press full criminal charges, or was there a path to justice that didn't involve sending his own son and brother to prison? Thank you for watching, and we'll see you for the next story. We'll explore what happens years later, when a granddaughter starts asking questions about the day her family broke.